In 1967, when Harlem was a mix of thriving street business and simmering political tension, Detective Charles "Charlie" Evans made a decision that would seal his fate. He thought his badge gave him immunity. He believed his corrupt dealings with crime bosses and his shady influence over the system made him untouchable. But he had no idea that by framing Bumpy Johnson, the legend of Harlem, he was stepping into a storm that would leave him buried in concrete just 48 hours later. Charlie Evans had no idea that he was about to face the ultimate justice from a man whose code was built on respect, not fear. Detective Charles Evans had spent years using his badge to secure power. He wasn't just a cop. He was a man who'd learned to manipulate both the system and the criminals he was supposed to bring down. Evans had the ear of politicians and the street bosses alike, playing both sides for personal gain. He kept his hands clean on the outside, but on the inside he was dirty, bought and paid for by anyone who could afford his services. The people of Harlem didn't know him by name, but they knew his work. He was the kind of cop who'd look the other way when the price was right. He was the kind of cop who would sell out a city for a few dollars. But his arrogance and thirst for more power had blinded him to one thing: respect. He had none for the people he was sworn to protect, and certainly none for Bumpy Johnson, the man who ran the streets with an iron fist of honor. Bumpy, unlike Evans, had earned his place not through bribery and corruption, but through loyalty and the respect of the community. Bumpy had built an empire on his own terms, and anyone who tried to undermine him would quickly learn that his reach was far more powerful than any badge or dollar. Evans didn't just cross Bumpy Johnson when he framed him for an armed robbery he didn't commit. He crossed the line of honor. And when you crossed that line with Bumpy, the consequences were always swift, sure, and devastating. Evans, in his desperate attempt to secure a larger cut of the city's underworld, framed Bumpy for a robbery that had gone terribly wrong. The robbery involved a group of wealthy businessmen with connections to both politicians and criminals, and Evans thought this was his chance to move up the ladder. If he could pin the robbery on Bumpy, a man whose name had clout but no real political protection, Evans would not only neutralize a major threat, but also position himself as a major player in the city's criminal underworld. But Evans didn't understand something fundamental about Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was a symbol of Harlem. He wasn't just powerful, he was untouchable. And when Evans targeted Bumpy, he wasn't just attacking a man, he was attacking everything that Harlem had come to trust. That mistake would be his last. Bumpy, ever vigilant, immediately understood the move. He didn't flinch in the face of the betrayal. Instead, he began to plot. The game wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. And Evans didn't even realize it. It started when Detective Charlie Evans, in his greed and desperation, planted the evidence that would frame Bumpy Johnson for an armed robbery that had gone wrong. The crime, which involved a failed heist on a shipment of cash meant for a local bank, left 2 men dead and several others seriously injured. Evans, working in conjunction with a few corrupt associates, knew that Bumpy's reputation would make him the perfect scapegoat. The people would believe it, and no one would question the arrest. Bumpy Johnson, however, was no stranger to being targeted by the law. He had spent his life dodging traps laid by men like Evans, men who thought they could play God with the streets. But this time, Evans had miscalculated. He underestimated Bumpy's reach. The evidence against Bumpy was fabricated. Witnesses were coerced, and physical evidence was planted at the scene. But there was one thing Evans hadn't counted on. Bumpy Johnson had eyes everywhere. As soon as the news broke, Bumpy knew something was off. The robbery was too clean, the police too eager. The people in Harlem weren't buying it. They knew who Bumpy was and what he stood for. This wasn't just an attack on a man. This was a full-fledged challenge to the community itself. Bumpy's response was calm, calculated. He didn't rush to clear his name. He let the heat build, knowing that his plan needed precision. He knew the people would back him up. The streets always knew the truth. But what really stung wasn't the arrest itself. It was the fact that Evans had used Bumpy's family as pawns in his game. The corrupt detective didn't just target Bumpy, he made sure to involve Bumpy's crew, aiming to fracture the trust Bumpy had built with the community. Bumpy, however, wasn't a man to be pushed into a corner. He understood the game. And in his silence, in his strategic restraint, He was already setting his trap. As soon as Bumpy Johnson caught wind of the framing, he knew he had to move carefully. Teddy, one of Bumpy's most trusted men, brought the news directly to him. "Boss, they're saying you pulled off that robbery. They've got the press running with it. They've even got witnesses." Bumpy didn't flinch. He took a long drag from his cigar, his eyes narrowing. "I know. It's a setup. Evans is behind this." Teddy stood still, waiting for Bumpy to say more. But Bumpy's silence was a signal in itself. He was planning, calculating every move. "I'm going to tell you something once, Teddy," Bumpy said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about me. They've crossed a line. They've taken something they shouldn't have, and they're going to pay for it. But I'm not going to do this in the streets. I'm going to teach them a lesson they'll never forget." The silence in the room grew heavier. Bumpy's men, standing in the corner, knew the situation had escalated beyond simple retaliation. This was personal now. This was a matter of honor. And Bumpy Johnson never let anyone dishonor him, his family, or the people of Harlem. "The only thing Evans didn't count on," Bumpy continued, "is that I've never been just a man. I'm Harlem. I'm the streets, and no one gets to come into my city and play with my name without consequences." As the clock ticked, Detective Evans sat in the comfort of his office, thinking he had won. The pieces were all in place. Bumpy was behind bars, his crew disbanded, his name smeared across the tabloids. Evans walked the streets with a sense of invincibility, believing that his political connections and his badge would shield him from any blowback. But what Evans didn't realize was that Bumpy Johnson wasn't defeated. He was simply biding his time. Bumpy's crew, loyal to him to the end, had begun gathering intel on Evans's every move. They knew Evans's weaknesses, the shady deals he'd been involved in, and the people he owed. The detective thought he was untouchable, but Bumpy was building the framework for retribution, one that would not just destroy Evans's career, but also his life. The 48-hour clock was ticking. Bumpy didn't rush into action. He let Evans think he was in control. The detective grew more comfortable, making plans to move even further up the political ladder. He had the mayor's ear. He had the city's elite backing him. And yet, with every passing hour, he walked deeper into the trap. But Bumpy, ever the strategist, wasn't just preparing his retaliation. He was making sure that when justice came, it would be swift and unrelenting. The trap was simple, but effective. Bumpy knew Evans's routine. He knew the places the detective frequented and the men who backed him. It wasn't just about the evidence. It was about putting Evans in a position where he had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The moment Evans realized he was exposed, it would be too late. Bumpy's men had positioned themselves around Evans's network, gathering intel, planting false leads, and creating pressure points that would force Evans to make the fatal mistake, underestimating Harlem's most legendary figure. At exactly 6 p.m., Bumpy's plan was in motion. Evans was about to be reminded that no one, not even a corrupt detective with connections, could escape the power of respect once it had been challenged. It was 48 hours later, on a dreary Tuesday evening, when Detective Charlie Evans walked into his favorite bar, an old, smoky place tucked away on the edge of Harlem. He had been celebrating what he thought was his victory, his reputation growing stronger with every passing minute. He had outsmarted Bumpy Johnson and the whole city, or so he thought. Evans, feeling untouchable, ordered a drink and sat at the far corner of the bar, watching the television in the corner as the news covered his successful case against Bumpy. But as he sipped his whiskey, the tension in the air began to thicken. Evans didn't notice it at first, but the people around him were growing quiet, glancing in his direction with looks that spoke volumes, the kind of looks that said, "You're next." What Evans didn't know was that Bumpy had already set the stage. He had sent a message through the streets, using his most trusted men to make sure that Evans knew his days of comfort were over. At exactly 8 p.m., as Evans continued to sip his drink, he noticed a group of men enter the bar. They were calm, silent, but their presence seemed to shift the atmosphere. One man, standing at the doorway, caught Evans's eye. It was Bumpy's Lieutenant Teddy, and he had a message that Evans would never forget. Evans's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the man immediately. The weight of his earlier decisions, the betrayals, the framing, the corruption, began to sink in. He was trapped. Just as Evans stood to leave, thinking he could make a quick escape, Bumpy Johnson's voice rang out from the back of the room. "Sit down, Charlie," Bumpy said, his calm tone cutting through the growing silence. "You've got nowhere to go." Evans froze. He turned slowly to face Bumpy, who was now standing just a few feet away from him, flanked by his men. The legend of Harlem's streets stood before him, and for the first time, Evans understood what real power looked like. Bumpy was unwavering, his eyes locked onto Evans's, his gaze piercing and cold. "You thought you could take me down with a lie, huh? You thought you could take my name and ruin me, just like that?" Evans tried to speak, his voice shaky. "Bumpy, You didn't think this through," Bumpy interrupted, his voice calm but full of conviction. "You didn't think about what happens when you cross a man who has built everything on honor and respect. You made the mistake of thinking you were above the law. But this isn't about the law, Charlie. This is about something you'll never understand." Evans, sweating, began to stutter. "Please, I thought I could control this. I didn't know what else to do. They promised." "Stop right there," Bumpy said, his voice like ice. "You thought you were untouchable, but the moment you framed me, you signed your own death sentence. I didn't need to play your game, Charlie. You think I'm just some criminal, but you're wrong. I'm a man of principle, and you disrespected that principle when you tried to tear me down." Bumpy stepped forward, now towering over Evans. "Your days of hiding behind that badge are over, and in this life, Charlie, you always have to pay the price for your mistakes. This is how it ends for you." Evans's face turned pale as he realized his fate, but it was too late. The trap had been set. The lesson had been delivered. Bumpy's men moved swiftly, disarming Evans and pulling him out of the bar. There would be no trial, no lawyers, no deal. Evans had crossed a line, and the only punishment that fit was the one Bumpy had planned. They dragged the detective through the back streets of Harlem, where no one would see. Evans, now realizing the magnitude of his miscalculation, begged and pleaded, but no one could hear him. Bumpy stood in the shadows, watching the events unfold. His crew worked with precision, a well-oiled machine that had executed the plan without hesitation. Charlie Evans, the corrupt detective who thought he could ruin Bumpy Johnson for his own gain, was about to disappear forever. The men carried Evans to an abandoned warehouse where the final act of justice awaited. Bumpy's men placed Evans in a deep pit, his fate sealed in concrete. As the heavy blocks were poured over him, Evans's last words, a final plea for mercy, were drowned out by the sound of the concrete pouring. The detective, who had tried to manipulate the system and destroy a legend, was now buried under the very streets he had betrayed. The next morning, Harlem buzzed with whispers. Detective Evans was missing. No one had seen him leave the bar, no one had heard a thing, and no one would ever speak of him again. The streets knew what had happened, though. They knew Bumpy Johnson had exacted his revenge, and that no one could touch him without facing the consequences. Bumpy didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to remind anyone of his power. His reputation was his message. The people who had once feared Evans now understood that the streets were his, and anyone who tried to manipulate them would pay the ultimate price. Bumpy's legend grew even larger, not just as a criminal mastermind, but as a man who fought for justice, for honor, and for his family. He had sent a message to everyone in the city. If you betray Harlem, you'll never escape it. What would you do if someone tried to frame you for something you didn't do, use their power to destroy your life? Would you run, or would you take back what was rightfully yours, like Bumpy Johnson did? If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem, and in the comments, what would you have done if you were Charlie Evans? More legendary stories coming soon. Don't miss it.